Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to today's IATEFL PronSIG webinar with Marnie Reed and Tamara Jones. My name is Louise, and I'm your host for the webinar. Our session today is called The Melody of English, Research and Resources for Teaching the Pragmatic Functions of Intonation. So just before we begin, can you just let me know that you can all hear me? So type a yes or hello or whatever you want into the text box there and let me know that you're here. Fantastic, thank you, Claire. So nobody here, the only people that you'll be able to hear are myself, Marnie and Tamara, our two speakers today, okay? If you have any questions, please just type them into the chat box that's there at the bottom of your screen, okay? Any questions you have for Marnie or Tamara, please just put them there and I'll make a note of them so that they can answer them later at an appropriate stage. All right. So just to give you a little bit of information, Marnie is the Associate Professor of Education and affiliated faculty in the program in Applied Linguistics at Boston University, where she directs the graduate TESOL program. Her current area of interest and research is in the role of metacognition in cross-linguistic awareness of the pragmatic functions of intonation. She is co-author of Sound Concepts, an integrated pronunciation course, and co-editor and chapter contributor to the forthcoming Wiley Handbook of English Pronunciation. Tamara holds a PhD in education from the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. She is taught in Russia, Korea, the United Kingdom, the United States, and in Belgium. She is currently an instructor at Howard Community College in Maryland. Tamara is the author of Q, Skills for Success, Listening and Speaking Level 4. There must be 50 ways to teach them vocabulary, and there must be 50 ways to teach them pronunciation. As well, she is the editor and chapter contributor of the forthcoming book, Integrating Pronunciation with Other Skills. So, whenever Marnie is ready, she's going to begin with her section of the presentation. Thank you, Marnie.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm very excited to be doing this. So I'm going to begin with the question that motivated me and my research, and that is, what is it that teachers don't understand about what it is that students don't understand about intonation? It took me a long time to realize I was making assumptions about what my students understood until I realized a lot of what I was doing was going right over their heads. So we can take a look at what the literature says, so based on some of the research, and I'm citing here from Larry Vandergrift and Christina Go. They have published separately and jointly, so I'm taking a quotation from a survey that they conducted that's reported in their book, Teaching Second Language Listening, Metacognition in Action. And their survey results indicate that students reach a threshold level of comprehension where they can understand all the words and they begin to realize they're missing the message. They're missing the point. So it would seem that the learners at some stage realize they're not catching the pragmatic functions of intonation. Okay, so that's what the research tells us. What exactly does that mean? So I'll take a typical example that might happen in an everyday classroom. A teacher has a late statement on the syllabus. Nevertheless, students always come in and ask questions like, can I turn in my homework late? And the teacher might reply, you can. And then the student sounds very relieved and says, oh, thank you, and walks away happy, intending to turn in the homework late. And you can imagine a very argumentative student who might say, but you gave me permission to turn in my paper late, when of course you weren't giving permission at all. So here's a case where the words are very affirmative, but the message is clearly negative. So what could account for this? Well, I'm going to turn now to John Wells, who in his introduction to English intonation made these three interesting points. A speaker may imply something without necessarily putting it into words. The speaker might state one thing but actually imply something further or in addition. or something is left unsaid, maybe a reservation or an implication. So in the case of you can, every native speaker knows that the next word is but. But our non-native speakers, our learners, don't catch that. Okay. Why might this be the case? Well, Judy Gilbert has made a suggestion in the Pronunciation Myths book that's published by the University of Michigan Press. And she makes the comment that because this system of English intonation is likely to be foreign to the students, they may not actually believe that the intonation affects the meaning. They may be very well aware of its melodic properties, but not believe that it means anything. So let's see how this might play out. I conducted a study a couple of years ago. I used remote response systems from my students to get their beliefs about the role of intonation. And I was doing this in 2 intact pronunciation classes in an intensive English program. And I asked them questions of this sort. So here's a sample. Which is more important for conveying meaning in a sentence? Would it be the words, or perhaps it's the intonation? And in this particular group, the students mostly said the words are more important than the intonation. In the other group, which I polled before I was using the remote clickers, 100% of the students said, no, it's the words. The words are much more important than the intonation. If those are their beliefs, how does that play out? So I gave them a sentence in a sound file. And I won't try the technology by playing the sound file. I'll do it for you. So as you can see, the word teacher is in italics, and it would be spoken with a rise, fall, intonation, pitch contour. The teacher didn't grade your papers. And the question that I posed was, have the papers been graded? And completely consistent with the responses in their metacognitive studies, 10 students said, no, the papers haven't been graded. And they wanted me to play that sound file repeatedly, which I did, and you could see them mimicking the words, didn't grade. And they were insistent, no, the papers were not graded, the word said didn't grade. Now these were the 2 highest levels in an intensive English program. So these were high, intermediate, and low and advanced level students. They had no problems with the passive voice construction, but they paid attention to the words, not the intonation. But of course we know that because that word teacher was spoken with a fall, rise, intonation contour, the speaker is signaling a different intent. So here we can go to the work by Anne Wickman, who has said actually intonation has the power to certainly reinforce or to mitigate or even undermine the words that were spoken. And I think that's what happened in this particular case. So what we discover is English has 2 mechanisms for conveying speaker intent. One, we can use ordinary grammar, subject, verb, object in the word order of English, but superimpose upon it an intonation contour that is highly marked or not the normal intonation contour. And of course, we can do this with any word at random in any sentence, whether a content word or a function word. So we have the 2 mechanisms. The second mechanism is we can change the grammar. We can use what is called an it cleft. Well, it wasn't the teacher who graded the papers, which clearly conveys they were graded, just not by the teacher. Other languages, however, may have at their disposal just one mechanism for this non-standard intention or meaning, and that may be just a syntactic variation. So English has at its disposal 2, other languages in the world may have just one, and so the students may not be sensitive to it. Let's take the second major problem that I see, and that is this one. Learners will rarely tell the teacher that they feel silly using the intonation contours of English, which, by the way, are at an extreme end of using a wide pitch contour for everyday, normal, unmarked meaning. Judy Gilbert continues, maybe students will think intonation is just decorative. So they're aware of it, they might think it's decorative, but they don't think it has any particular meaning. I actually polled the students in the class where I was conducting my research, and I asked them, after they had successfully produced the target-like intonation in the language lab setting, would they continue to use it because they sounded very native-like in their production? And they said, of course not. And in fact, the male students said, only women speak this way. They all said, I feel silly, I feel foolish, and this whole thing sounds ridiculous. I will never speak this way. We want to keep in mind, thinking about the work of Murray Monroe and Tracy Derwing, that it is not our intention to impose upon our learners a forced sound of some variant of English, North American, UK, whatever. So they certainly have the right to reject adopting this in their speech. The problem becomes when they're not sensitive to it, cannot use it for decoding, and they're missing real world information or real world content. They're missing speaker intent or real world meaning. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because what they believe influences how they approach listening. And if they believe that the intonation is just decorative, then they're not paying attention. They're not sensitive to the fact that the normal range of intonation is already more exaggerated than the intonation pitch range for many languages, and they are not at all sensitive to when we use it to provide extra meaning or extra belief. So their beliefs are going to underpin their strategies. So what's the problem here? We end up with not only gaps in the metacognition of our learners, but especially the danger is if we have gaps as teachers. And I think native speakers are at a greater risk because we use these intonation contours unconsciously without even being aware that we're doing it. And yet the meanings may be going over our learners' heads. And so we have this disturbing quote here. Students often don't have a clear idea of why this melody of a speech should be important. So therefore, they don't seem motivated to master it. And the teachers maybe are not theoretically equipped or practically equipped with how to deal with it in the classroom. So what exactly is this intonation? I'm going to quote here from Lucy Pickering in the encyclopedia, the Rutledge work. Systematic and linguistically meaningful use of pitch movement at the phrase level or the suprasegmental level. And again, I want to point out, if we think of the languages in the world and how they use intonation, and we put it on a continuum, English is at the extreme end. To some extent, German, Turkish, and Arabic are at that end, but English at the absolute extreme end of its use of pitch movement for normal discourse, and then an extra use of it to convey a speaker intent where we're making an implication. So what's the problem in teaching? Sometimes I think what happens is we spend a lot of time on the attitude or affective areas of teaching intonation, the things that we may be aware that we're doing, being sarcastic, showing anger or surprise. And Levis points out there's a danger if all we do with intonation is show these attitudinal or emotional affective aspects of intonation. And his claim is that the research doesn't translate to the texts. And I've made the claim in several places that a lot of the materials are very well informed by the research, but in the hands of a teacher who doesn't understand what it is that the learners don't understand, then we may be working at a surface level where we get the students to produce or imitate the intonation without forcing a discussion of why. Why is this pitch range so exaggerated? What is it trying to convey? What's the hidden message? So let's see how we do that. What would success actually look like? It would actually look like being able we want to work at two levels. At the metacognitive level, to be able to grasp and tell you back that this intonation contour for normal English is already Now, this semester I'm working with a students in an intermediate level. Their term is dramatic. English intonation sounds dramatic. Other semesters, the words that the students use are sing-songy. English is very sing-songy. Whatever words your students want to use to describe the ordinary, normal, unmarked intonation, that's fine. Go with those words. But we want them to say then that the normal is already exaggerated. That's the word that John Wells uses. And that special intonation is going to signal the speaker intent. The speaker is giving you a message, and it's in the music. It's in the melody of the language. Either they're making a contrast, which they may state explicitly or not, or they're making an implication. And your task as a learner is to infer. So what will success look like? They will begin to process the prosodic information as well as the lexical information and realize that the message may be encoded in more than just the words, but in the music. They know that this is true with idioms. When they learn idioms, that the meaning is greater than the sum of all the words. We want to convey that same effect for intonation. So let's go back to the question about the teacher and the student. How do we get them to begin to do it? Well, we can juxtapose the two sentences. We can play them sound files where we're not changing anything by what would be represented on paper as using italics to represent that I'm signaling a different meaning. Play the two sound files, and step one would be, can the students hear the difference between the teacher didn't grade the papers, the teacher didn't grade the papers? Can we get them to the point where they hear these two sentences back to back and can identify what you may be playing the same one, so 1 and 1 or 2 and 2, but when you play 1 versus 2, can they hear that there's a difference? Once we get them to identify, oh yes, I noticed that there's a difference. It's extra sing-songy, it's extra dramatic, whatever words they want to use, then the correct response will look like this. No, those two sentences were different. The second one had a special pitch. And then we pose the question again. The teacher didn't grade your papers. Now tell me, have the papers been graded? If our intonation is the teacher didn't grade, and they're able to decode as well as tell you metalinguistically. So I will stop here. I see that there are some questions coming through, and we'll take some questions before we turn it over then to Tamara, who's going to get into the practical aspects, the nitty-gritty aspects of, okay, so if this is all true, what do we do about it?
Okay, so does anybody have any questions then for Marnie? If you do, just please type them into the chat box.
Yes, so let me go back and address some of the things I'm seeing in the chat boxes. In the case that I mentioned earlier, when I was conducting a study, I was not focused on intonation in that study. And so I attended 2 pronunciation electives for an entire semester. And I only worked on morphosyntax. That was what I was investigating. And regarding the intonation, that had been my distractor questions. I ended up becoming more interested. The teachers in the class told me they could hardly wait to get to the lesson on intonation, and their focus was, here's a series of decontextualized sentences, let's read them, and you have to read them with the correct surprise or anger or whatever the emotion was. And the students went through the motions, not sure they were particularly engaged. When the teachers had the students truly dealing with the functions, the pragmatic functions of intonation, they could get the students to produce it in a language lab. And it was after that that the students said, I'll never use this. The teachers didn't ask the question, will you use it? They left the room. I stayed in the lab. I asked the question. When I spoke with the teachers afterwards, they were very happy. I finally taught intonation today. I got them to do it. So I think one danger is we get them to produce it without dealing with why it's so exaggerated and what's the hidden message. And we don't realize the students are rejecting it. Yes, contrast is also one of the functions. So in many of the world's languages, we can see some of the difference. For example, supposing I said, I'm going to use the phone number here of the BU switchboard. Is the phone number 353-2000? And if that's wrong, a native speaker will say, no, it's 358-2000. So we really nail where the difference is. When we've run the same experiments with our students, they make the correction without using the exaggerated pitch to signal the number that you got wrong was the 3 versus the 8. They don't show where the contrast is with intonation. So it's not universal.
So Marnie, we've got a couple of questions there. Manuela has asked, do you think listening and repeating dialogues are useful for teenage learners?
My approach is a two-strand, so-called metacognitive as well as skills. So getting them to listen and repeat without understanding why is only spinning our wheels, so to speak, at a surface level if we don't deal with the underlying thinking that's involved. So teenagers might find it engaging to do, but the question is why. So I want to steer away from just getting them to imitate without understanding what's the function of the dialogue.
Thank you. And Olga is also wondering if there's a list of pragmatic functions of intonation somewhere that teachers could refer to.
Mm-hmm. There may well be. So I'd look at the work of Anne Wickman and John Levis, Levis, among others. John Wells, I've already mentioned, but we can certainly list several of the pragmatic functions, not just the grammatical indicating thought groups. So we can look at the work of Judy Gilbert for thought groups and so forth. So the pragmatic functions go back to saying more than, implying more than what was actually spoken. So this would be the implicature is the technical term that's used. So John Wells refers to this as implicational intonation, the implicational fall, rise, pitch contour. And second one would be showing contrast. We can also talk about given versus new information and the ability to predict what's going to happen next. So the example that I mentioned from the language lab where the students produced a sentence with the appropriate pitch contour on a word that was italicized. So they were tasked with reading a sentence, recording themselves in the lab, and the first word in the first sentence was in italics, and they read it as if it was not. And the sentence was something like this: some companies in the high-tech sector sell a wide variety of products. And it ended up that we spent 50 minutes in the language lab getting the students to produce that sentence. They became aware that they weren't going to move on until they did it to please the teacher. So their intonation became increasingly target-like, and the teacher told them each in turn, okay, hit record, you've got it. And so that was the point where I asked them, you really sounded native-like, will you use it? That's the point where they said, no, I'll never use this. It's foolish and I feel ridiculous. The next week I devised a slide and I said, okay, listen to this sentence. Some companies in the high-tech sector sell a wide variety of products. Predict what will be the topic of the next sentence. Choice 1, the wide variety of products. Choice 2, other companies that don't sell a variety of products. 99% of the students chose the wide variety of products, and one student said, well, we don't know what the next sentence will be till we hear it. And I asked, but you just produced this sentence last week in the language lab. Would it surprise you to know that every native speaker will know what the topic of the next sentence is based on the non-standard intonation? It violated the norm. So our students then are playing catch up. They're listening to academic lectures, following along, but the native speaker is primed to know what to expect based on intonation that violates a norm. So Mohammed is asking, do they need to pay attention to implicational intonation? And my point is yes, they do. So for the students who answered the papers haven't been graded, that's a fact in the real world. So if they were told, well, the teacher didn't grade your papers, and they walk away assuming the papers haven't been graded, they're missing a fact, a real fact in the real world, where every native speaker would know, of course they've been graded, just not by the teacher. Maybe she has a TA. So yes, they need to be able to detect it and assume that the speaker is signaling a special intent. Tench, yes, Paul Tench. I see Marina is supplying information. Paul Tench presents a whole list of the functions. Excellent.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Marnie. That's great. There's one other question there I think you see from Olaf. Do you use any explicit visually based system to connect intonation to syntax?
One of the things that we've started to do recently is going back to this idea of read aloud. So when I also observe classes, because I oversee my student teachers, and they all tend to do this read aloud. So students read text. So we've been giving them text with italicized words, and we discovered that they don't treat the words in italics any differently from the way they treat words that are not in italics. Maybe they think it's a Microsoft Word convention. You can use bold, you can underline, you can use 12-point font or 14-point font. So another option is italics, but they don't seem to think it means anything. So one of the things we did in this intensive English program on our campus was tell the students as a homework assignment, take this one passage, it's a very short passage, and go around to the administrators here in the school or any other native speaker you can find, stick this under their nose and say, would you please help me with my homework assignment? Could you please just read this passage? And then pay attention to what the native speakers do with the two words that are in italics and come back and report to the class. And this is the point when the students begin to come back and say, you're right. They did this weird thing with those two words. So they're beginning to raise their awareness or their consciousness that native speakers do this, that it must mean something. In this case, it was a contrast. The passage that we gave them was a New York Times article, and the two words were in contrast.
Brilliant. Okay, I think that's all of the questions there, Marnie. I think is everything. So if there's no more questions, I suppose we could move on to Tamara's section presentation. Okay, so thank you very much, Marnie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tamara, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the resources for teaching the pragmatic functions of intonation. So Marnie talked a lot about the research side, and I find it extremely useful and really interesting. But hopefully I'll be able to supply you with some ideas as to how you can implement some of these things in your classrooms, some activities that we can do to teach focus or intonation. So as Marnie was saying, there are several different functions of this kind of exaggerated intonation. She did mention speaker attitude, which would be like sarcasm, or, you know, if I ask someone, how are you today? And the person said, great. So again, kind of showing their attitude. There's also the contrast of information. And my favorite example is Marnie's when she says, the teacher didn't grade the papers. And as well, we often use it for strong agreement. So an example of this would be, she does have a good point. And with this, we're not only using this rising, falling intonation, but we're also breaking a grammar rule by often throwing in an auxiliary verb that shouldn't be there by grammatical norms. So when students aren't able to understand and hear and manipulate the melody of English in this way to communicate this, then it leads to what I call an intonation gap. So first of all, speaker attitude. There's a lot of argument, and Brazel and the gang said that there were no arguments for teaching intonation in terms of attitude because the rules for use are too obscure, too amorphous, and too easily refutable. And Gimson in 2008 goes on to suggest that teaching English tones should be really restricted to those learners who are aiming at near native pronunciation targets. To be honest, I'm not sure I wholeheartedly agree with that. I have a Korean dry cleaner here in Baltimore who's a wonderful guy, very polite, and I really enjoy working with him. And he always says, "Thank you very much. Please come again," following polite Korean intonation patterns. But actually, it can sound like he's saying, "Get out of my store. I don't want to see you again." Just because, as Marnie said, the intonation, the melody of his voice is overriding the actual words he's using. There's not, so I don't necessarily wholeheartedly agree that we shouldn't teach speaker attitude at all, even though there's a lot of experts that would disagree with me. However, there is not time in today's webinar to really take on that debate. So instead, I'll be focusing on contrasting information and activities for strong agreement as well. So contrasting information. Rogerson-Ravel, in her outstanding IATEFL presentation in 2012, said, "Unlike many other languages where grammatical inflection, word order, or lexis is used to signal contrast or important information, English does this largely through phonology." So as Marnie was saying, this is huge because if our students aren't hearing it, they are missing a huge piece of information that proficient English speakers or native English speakers are getting. So this is really important. And the first, the first step would be noticing. And Marnie talked about her activity, which I've tweaked a little bit to put in among my slides as well, because I think it's a really useful first step. She talked about her activity where she gave the students a text that had some italicized words and asked them to take it to the proficient English speakers in their location. I think it was the office of the intensive English program. And she asked for homework that they take this text to the proficient English speakers and have their speakers read the text. And as she found, the students were astonished to discover that, in fact, the proficient English speakers read the passage in exactly the same way. So I think this part of noticing is a really important first step in kind of selling this to them. Because as Marnie was saying, if they don't get that there is meaning here, then they think it's just silly, it's foolish, they feel stupid doing it, and they don't want to do it. And so I think that having them, that first step of taking the text to native English speakers or proficient English speakers and having them read that, and then again, they're really surprised when the native English speakers or proficient English speakers read it exactly in the same way. Now, Marnie's text was a bit longer. I think it came from the New York Times, I think she was saying. But with some of my lower level students, I've actually used kind of shorter sentences that I have here. But again, it's really important to have the italicized words there. So they become aware that the pitch change exists in reality and not just in the minds of their pronunciation teachers. Once they've noticed it and noticed that it actually exists, it's really useful to have some kind of awareness raising activity that helps them realize that there's definitely meaning associated with this, that we're not just reading these italicized words funny because they're italicized, but there's actually meaning to it. And Marnie was also touching on this in her research as well. Linda Grant in her book, her textbook, Well Said, has a really nice chapter on focus. And so she has this passage that I've kind of taken out and tweaked a little bit so that it fits my purposes for awareness raising. And she has a sentence that says, "Let's continue our discussion of pollution. Yesterday, we defined pollution." And then the next step is for the students to guess, okay, what will the speaker probably say next? Today we'll talk about the impact of pollution, or today we'll define acid rain. Well, again, proficient English speakers and proficient English listeners in this case would definitely notice that the answer is A, that we're going to talk about the impact of pollution. Because yesterday we defined pollution, today we'll talk about the impact of pollution. And we know this simply and only because of the intonational implicature, because of that focus or prominence on the word defined. And we know that good listeners, they don't just listen and understand, they are also predicting what will come next. And without this toolbox, without this understanding of what this intonation is meaning, our students are not able to predict what comes next. So it's often very surprising to them to realize that, in fact, we're giving off cues left, right, and center about what is actually going to come next. So doing some kind of awareness raising activity like this can be really useful for them. And again, it really helps sell them on the notion that this has meaning and this is really important. Another activity that's similar to the one I just described comes from the old TOEFL. The TOEFL prep materials for the computer-based test and the paper-based test. TOEFL used to have a listening, kind of a listening activity where they'd have these short conversations. And the Longman Complete Course for the TOEFL CBT textbooks refers to this as expressions of emphatic surprise. So I still actually have this old CD, but certainly it's possible just to read the sentences out to my students. And then I have them hold up 1, 2, 3, or 4 fingers to indicate what they think the meaning, the assumption that the speaker is making. And then immediately I can see whether they're getting it or not getting it. So for example, the woman says, "Would you like to go skiing this weekend?" And the man says, "So you can ski." So what had the man assumed? And then the students would look at the possible answers, A through D, and then they would say, I think C. And I can, again, see very quickly if the students are actually getting are making the correct assumptions, if they're getting the right answer or not. So it's a fun way to see whether or not the students are able to understand this change in pitch. This activity comes from Melody Noel. She has an excellent book called Intonation, Reductions, and Word Connections. And she has a matching activity in which there's one sentence and the students have to listen and decide what the sentence means when the pitch is shifted from one word to another. So, for example, the teacher might read, "I took the 10:20 evening train from Los Angeles to San Francisco." And when I stress 10:20 evening train, what I mean is not D, not the 12:20 evening train, but the 10:20 evening train. So I'm using this kind of pitch contour to show a contrast in meaning. Another example is, and this one, I like this one because this always stumps the students. "I took the 10:20 evening train from Los Angeles to San Francisco." I took the 10:20 evening train. And of course I mean C, not the ordinary train, the famous train, the train. So that can be a really fun way. And then once I've done it a couple of times, then the students themselves can read to partners back and forth, and they can be deciding what the speaker is implying, what the speaker is saying with with prominence on a different word. Once students have kind of been sold on this idea that this is really actually very important in English conversation and speech, then it's a good idea for them to practice a lot, and so until they themselves can kind of own these different pitch changes. Judith Gilbert refers to this in her text using the prosody pyramid as quality repetition. Of course, she suggests using a rubber band to pull down on the stressed words, the words that have prominence. So, for example, what's the matter? What did you do? I can't believe it. And students are supposed to pull on this rubber band. I like a really big, thick rubber band because then the students really have to pull to feel the intonation, the focus. As well, using any kind of other movements. There's a definite argument for using multimodality and controlled practice because it leads to left brain and right brain involvement, and it also appeals to a variety of different kinds of learners. If you don't have rubber bands, it's really easy to do. Oh, let me shift here so you can see my hand. To just do it with an open hand on the focus word and a closed hand on the other word. So you must be joking. I see what you mean. So opening and closing the hand. Really quick, really easy. Students feel the prominence. They feel the intonation change. Again, from Noels' book, Intonation Reduction and Word Connections, she's got a whole list of other body movements you could do. Opening your eyes wide and relaxing them. For example, what's the matter? And you must be joking. Or you can use your eyebrows like, I see what you mean. Or what did you do? Also, walking the words, rising up on the prominent word and sitting down. Some really fun activities to help students, again, really feel this different pitch. Finally, this is my favorite suggestion. I have never actually been able to try it. But Linda Grant suggests using yo-yos. If you ever have a class set of yo-yos, you hand out yo-yos to each student, and then you have them, drop the yo-yo on the focus word. So you must be joking. And again, it's like a kind of a long fall down and rise up for the yo-yo, but this would really help students draw out that prominent word as long as necessary. So those kinds of things can be really fun, and they can make intonation, repetition a little more interesting. Card matches are another fun way to warm up the students once they have already had a lot of practice repeating the intonation changes. And so I have taken some of the sentences like what I would use in that TOEFL activity, the TOEFL prep activity I was referring to earlier, or just simply a sentence like, for example, I want to learn to ski on my holiday. It's a really neutral sentence until you start shifting the prominence. So I want to learn to ski on my holiday, or I want to learn to ski on my holiday, or I want to learn to ski on my holiday, or I want to learn to ski on my holiday. So basically you write the sentence out and then highlight or italicize or bold the prominent word. And then, so 4 different times, for example, and if you have 8 students, for example, and then on the other different color cards, you have the actual meaning of, again, what that sentence means. So for example, I want to learn to ski on my holiday means my husband already knows how to ski, but I want to learn. Or I want to learn to ski on my holiday means I'm not interested in learning to swim or to surf, but I want to know how to ski. So so I give one card to each student. The students with the yellow cards with the repeated sentence but the shifted focus stand up and walk around the room and read their sentence with the correct intonation, with the correct prominence. And the students who have the meaning cards have to listen and then read their sentence, and the students together decide if this is a match or if they have two different meanings. And when the students have found their match, then they sit together and that is their partner for the day. Obviously, this doesn't work particularly well in a class of 50 students, but it's I have classes of about 20, and this can be a really fun, quick warm-up activity. I saw a question earlier about marking the dialogue and having students repeat dialogues. I think it can be an excellent idea. Again, once the students are aware and they have kind of bought into this notion that it's actually really important and there's a lot of meaning here. So when the students, when it's time for them to move on to kind of marking dialogues, then I have to carefully choose the dialogue that I want to use. In this case, there's a really funny YouTube video, and just a minute, I'm going to tell you, if you go to YouTube and search for Seinfeld car reservation, you'll see this video, and I think this particular part of the conversation comes about 30 seconds into the video. And basically the students need to, first of all, I give them the text and they need to predict. So where did they think the pitch change might occur? Then we listen to the dialogue and they mark it and they kind of confirm or correct their predictions. Then we check it as a class, and we may play it a couple of times before we check it, just so everyone's got a chance to really listen. And then they're going to say the dialogue with the speakers. So I play it and they repeat, not repeat, but they say with, actually. They read the dialogue with the speakers, with Jerry and the receptionist. And then they rehearse with a partner, and finally they perform it in front of the class if we have time. And again, I really like this dialogue because there are a lot of different focus, and it's not always at the end. It's not like a normal pitch change at the end. These are things that are happening in the middle. So Seinfeld says, "I don't understand. I made a reservation. Don't you have my reservation?" And the receptionist says, "Yes, we do. Unfortunately, we ran out of cars." And Seinfeld says, "But the reservation keeps the car here. That's why you have the reservation." And the receptionist says, "I know why we have reservations." And Seinfeld says, "I don't think you do. If you did, I'd have a car. See, you know how to take the reservation. You just don't know how to hold the reservation. And that's really the most important part of the reservation, the holding. Anybody can just take them." So again, I really like this dialogue because there's lots of very interesting pitch changes, and they all have a very contrastive meaning. Another dialogue that's a little bit shorter and is actually quite funny is that it comes from Friends. And so if you go into YouTube and you search for Friends, It's Not a Cat, you will find this video clip. And it's basically Rachel gets that kind of freaky cat with no hair, and Joey and Ross are reacting to it. So again, it's quite amusing, and the students would do exactly the same thing. They listen, they predict, they listen, we check, they practice, and they perform. Another activity comes from Noels, intonation, reductions, and word connections again. Basically, you just have the students complete the sentence with true information about themselves, and then they will stand up with their paper and walk around the room and meet a partner. They give their partner their paper, and they take their partner's paper. From that, then their partner will read a sentence, but they will purposely get something wrong. So for example, if I have written, my favorite color is red, my partner would say, your favorite color is black? And I would say, no, my favorite color is red. And I'd use exaggerated intonation to correct. And I just usually have this, I have them doing this maybe with 5 partners really quickly. From one of Linda Grant's older editions of Well Said, and as I said, she's got a great chapter on focus, there's an excellent activity called What Comes Before, and students find this incredibly difficult, but proficient English speakers can do this simply because of this intonational contour. So for the example is excellent. It says, the statement says, I'm afraid I see some disadvantages. And then the students have to work together to guess the preceding statement, which is this plan has a lot of advantages. There's sometimes more than one right answer for this, but it's really helpful for students to understand that from sentences, we can guess what comes before. As well, and this is kind of where we're getting into the less controlled practice, of course, what comes next. I like to make this into a board game. I just use a Word document and then we go around the board and the students land on these sentence prompts and they have to fill in the rest. So for example, if the student landed on Harry Potter is my favorite book, but Titanic is my favorite movie, they would have to complete something like this. All right, so we're running, I've talked, I think, a bit too much. I'm running a little short on time, but why don't we just take a couple of questions right off the bat. I think I can look in the notes. Olga says, yes, a great idea. I'm not sure how to implement it in a non-English speaking environment, though. I think probably you're referring to the situation where the students have to go to proficient English speakers and ask them to read the sentences. And I think it doesn't have to be a native English speaking, a native English speaker. You could get proficient English speakers. Or if you could, I mean, it'd be a really nice project for someone to get a bunch of proficient English speakers with lots of different accents to be writing, to be reading some sentences on YouTube or something, the same sentence, the same group of sentences, and they'll all have the
Okay, I think we have lost Tamara there. Just bear with us for a moment. Sorry, everyone. We've just lost Tamara there. Her signal has gone. But Marnie said that she's happy to deal with any of the questions that that you may have or that we have here that we've kept a record of. So thank you very much for that, Marnie.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can indeed, Marnie. Thank you.
Excellent. So I like the kinds of questions that are coming. The one that I responded to in notes is from Muhammad Al-Zaidi, who's asking, should the intonation be taught separately? And my response is that I believe all aspects of intonation should be, of pronunciation in general, should be incorporated into core classes, integrated skills classes, and not treated separately, not left for the teacher down the hall who does the pronunciation elective and nobody else touches it. The way that I start to get the students to the point where they can ultimately succeed at this implicational intonation that I mentioned is to start all the way back at the level of syllables, disyllabic words. So when you have a word with 2 syllables, what I want the students to be able to tell me back is that in English, stress patterns alternate. So some students come from languages where the stress pattern, the lexical stress pattern is fixed. So students from those languages never have to think about which syllable gets the primary stress. Some come from languages that where each syllable is relatively equal in duration. Those students never have to pay attention to which syllable gets the primary stress. So I work with syllable at the syllable level when you have 2 words, for example, person versus percent, or differ versus defer. You have a change in stress, and the students have to pay attention to the fact that when they're learning new vocabulary words, part of what they have to learn is how many syllables and which one gets the primary stress. From there, I often use a set of words where when you change the stress pattern, you've changed the lexical category. So for example, I bought a present, he presented the information. So present, the noun, present, the verb. Then I move to the phrasal level, on the table, in the office, in the morning. Just ordinary phrases, and show that the function words are unstressed. I'll present them visually, grayed out, and the content word in full black is the word that gets the primary duration. Then move to the ordinary sentence level. So John likes pizza, just an ordinary SVO sentence. And then start changing the intonation on any one of the words and showing that we have a different focus or prominence that we're talking about. John likes pizza. I'm surprised that it's John, that sort of thing. So I believe that this should be incorporated into ordinary classes. And the nice tie-in with reading is you have a visual representation on the page of the oral information in the intonation pitch contour. And you can say, here's a signal. And sometimes the speaker's intent is conveyed on the printed page by the use of italics. And then you take it to where the italics wouldn't necessarily show up on the printed page, but they would be there orally. And I'm looking to see other questions. Yes,
I think, Marnie, there was... Oh, sorry, just there was a response. I think Olaf had a question earlier, and you wrote in a response into the notes, so maybe it might be worth mentioning that about the orthographic representation of intonation.
Yes, so Olaf picked up on the point that I'm saying students often overlook this. And if you have had your students read aloud passages where words are italicized deliberately by the author, that you might have noticed that they tend to read those no differently from the way they would read them if the words were not in italics. And so I think that it's very nice to be able to make a tie-in to the printed page and simply ask them to scan and mention visually, what do you notice? Well, visually, these particular words look different. And if I think about my Microsoft Word, they're not in bold, they're not underlined, they're in italics. And we have to teach them that how to say that these words are in italics, or these words are italicized. So you get them to notice that and then ask, well, why? The author must have done that deliberately. And it's not as simple as changing the font size or changing the font itself, Times New Roman to Helvetica or something. That was a deliberate choice by an author. So it's a signal. The author is signaling you something. You can't interpret that sentence the way you would if those words were not in italics. So I think that's a great way to begin tying the reading into the regular integrated skills. Oh, and then how do we teach the unmarked intonation? I focused on the marked intonation, getting them to do something, and what they have to do may include pausing, using the fall, rise, implicational contour, And yes, possibly also all of the paralinguistics. But you may have noticed, here's where it also shows up when we do corrective feedback or error correction. So let us say we have a student who makes a mistake and we use one of the feedback mechanisms that has been cited by Roy Lister or in several of his publications. So let's use repetition with intonation. So you have a student who says, every Friday, Luis, go to the bank. And you've been teaching third person singular inflectional morphology. And so you make a correction. Every Friday, Luis, go to the bank. You have just signaled a mistake occurred. The mistake was on the word go. And if you have taught third person singular, then they know what they need to do to fix it. When I've done this in class, my students can often tell from my paralinguistics that I'm annoyed with them or something is wrong. And so they try to figure out what to fix. And sometimes they'll think, oh, it's those prepositions. Luis go at the bank, Luis go by the bank, Luis go in the bank. So they're not sensitive to the fact that I have just clued them into where the mistake was by my use of intonation. So it has these various functions. Let's see.
Brilliant. Okay, Marnie, I think that's all we have time for. So thank you very much for taking those questions. Hopefully Tamara can catch up with us afterwards. So everybody, thank you so much for coming. Thank you very much for participating and for all of your questions. The recording of this session will be available on the IATEFL website. I'm not sure when it could. I presume it'll be up fairly shortly anyway. And I think it's just accessible for members only. So thank you very much for coming. And oh yes, and I will also post the citations, the references, on the Facebook Facebook page, the PronSIG Facebook page as well. So if you're not friends with us on Facebook, you can find us at IATEFL PronSIG, and I'll post everything up there. So thank you so much for attending, and Marnie, thank you so much again for stepping in and helping us out there. Okay, bye everybody. Just a final note, actually, for anybody who was wondering, we unfortunately can't give certificates of attendance for this webinar. I've just contacted head office and they've let us know, so I'm very sorry about that. Okay, thank you.